In the heart of St. Petersburg, amidst the cold winds and gray skies of Russia, lives Makar Devushkin, a poor and humble clerk. His existence is marked by the crushing weight of poverty, his life a series of monotonous days spent in a small, run-down apartment which he shares with no one but his thoughts and the occasional draft of wind slipping through the cracks of the walls. His neighbors are a reflection of the world he inhabits, tattered, struggling, but somehow still clinging to the semblance of a life. Makar's days are spent in an office, where he works diligently yet inconspicuously, performing menial tasks that seem to erase his existence from the world. His salary is insufficient, his prospects bleak. Despite his position, he does not complain. Instead, he writes. His letters to Varvara, a young woman he once met years ago and who now lives in a faraway district of St. Petersburg, are his only solace. Varvara is a seamstress, struggling in her own right, but she represents something different for Makar. She is a beacon of light in the otherwise dim world that surrounds him. In his letters, he pours out his heart, sharing the details of his humble life, the small joys, the moments of sadness, and his deepest reflections on the futility of his existence. He longs for a connection, a bond that transcends the miserable, reality that defines both their lives. Through these letters, he shares his thoughts with Varvara, hoping that she might understand him, perhaps even offer him a glimpse of something beyond his suffering. Dearest Varvara, he writes, his handwriting trembling with emotion, I spent the entire day thinking about you again. Your letters always bring warmth to my heart, even in this cold apartment where I am alone. It's not much, but I find comfort in knowing that you are out there, working, striving, just like me. Do you ever wonder, though, if we are destined to remain in this place forever? Sometimes I dream of a better life, one where I could offer you something more than these words. Makar's affection for Varvara is pure, yet his self-awareness constantly gets in the way of his desires. He knows that he is nothing, merely a clerk who is barely scraping by. He wishes, in his heart of hearts, that he could be more for her, but the reality of his position tells him otherwise. He remains a shadow in her life, existing only through the words he sends her, but what Makar does not realize is that his letters are more than just a simple exchange of pleasantries. They are the only thread connecting him to a world outside of his poverty. His connection with Varvara, though distant, is the only thing that keeps his fragile sense of hope alive. Yet, as much as Makar longs for something more, there is always the shadow of his own limitations hovering over him. He knows that he is small in the grand scheme of things, and that knowledge stings him with every passing day. He has little to offer, no way to rise above his station. His dreams, like the fading ink on his letters, are ephemeral, quickly fading in the harsh light of his daily life. Makar's poverty is not just a physical state, it is a mental and emotional one. His life is defined by a deep, almost existential isolation. He is a man whose soul is locked away in a prison of his own making, constantly questioning whether he deserves better or if he is simply condemned to live in obscurity. But in the quiet moments, when the sound of the city fades away, and he is alone with his thoughts, Makar dares to believe that there might be something more. Perhaps in Varvara's eyes, there is a future where his poverty does not define him, where love could lift him from the depths of his despair. He writes again, his words carefully formed, as if he is constructing a future through the letters he sends her. Varvara, do you think we could ever be more than just words on paper? Do you think there's a chance for us to escape this wretched life and find happiness, however fleeting it may be? I long to hear your thoughts, to know if you feel the same. In his letters, Makar's dreams intertwine with his fears, and his love for Varvara becomes a fragile hope that flickers in the dark. As Makar Devushkin awakes each day, he is greeted not by the promise of hope, but by the relentless reality of his existence. The apartment is cold, the walls thin and creaking, as if they too bear the weight of his sorrow. The faint light filtering through the grimy windows seems like a mockery of the warmth that never touches his life. He can hear the footsteps of his neighbors in the hall, their voices muffled through the thin walls. Yet, despite the crowded building, Makar feels utterly alone. His only companions are the quiet hum of his office, the occasional rustle of Varvara's letters, and the ever-present shadow of his own poverty. He dresses each morning in the same worn-out clothes, the ones he bought years ago, when the world seemed like a place full of possibilities. The coat that once seemed sturdy now hangs loosely from his shoulders, its fabric frayed and thin. He doesn't have the luxury of vanity, and so he wears his poverty like a cloak, a constant reminder of his failures. The walk to the office is always the same, a slow shuffle through crowded streets filled with men and women who seem to have a purpose, while he drifts aimlessly, unsure of where he's going, or if he's even meant to go anywhere at all. At the office, Makar's days are long and unremarkable. He sits at a small, cluttered desk, buried in stacks of paperwork that seem to multiply with every passing moment. His work is monotonous, repetitive, a task that demands no creativity or thought. He stamps documents, files papers, and sends. Occasional letters to clients, nothing that could ever lead to advancement or recognition. His colleagues, too, are trapped in their own struggles. They pay him little mind, seeing him as just another cog in the machine of bureaucracy. The office is a cold, indifferent space, where the air is thick with the scent of ink and the ticking of the clock is a constant reminder of how little time matters in this world. Despite the drudgery of it all, Makar remains diligent. He knows that his work is insignificant, but he does it anyway, if only to feel that he has some control over the small things in his life. Each day, he looks forward to the end of the workday when he can return to his apartment and indulge in the only source of joy he has left, writing his letters to Varvara. But as the days go by, Makar begins to feel the weight of his isolation more acutely. His letters to Varvara, once full of optimism and longing, now feel heavier. He begins to question whether she even reads them anymore. The small acts of kindness he once offered to strangers, holding a door open, offering a smile, have faded. He's too tired now, too worn down by the grinding monotony of his life. When he does receive letters from Varvara, they bring him a fleeting sense of relief, but the joy is always short-lived. In her letters, Varvara describes her own struggles, long hours of sewing, the exhaustion of poverty, and the loneliness that she too endures. She speaks of small pleasures, like a cup of tea shared with a fellow worker, or the brief respite of a quiet evening. Yet, even as she writes to him, Makar senses the distance between them growing. She speaks of her life in a way that makes him feel small, as if her world is full of people and opportunities he will never know. He begins to wonder if his letters are nothing more than a burden to her, a reminder of the life she is trying so hard to escape. "Dearest Varvara," he writes, his pen trembling as he pours out his thoughts, "I received your letter, and while it brought me some comfort, I cannot help but feel that we are growing further apart. I know my words must seem tiresome to you, and I fear that I am only adding to your burden. I do not wish to be a source of sorrow for you. But you are the only one who understands me, who knows what it is to struggle as I do. Can you tell me, Varvara, is there any hope for us? Or are we doomed to live these lives, these small, insignificant lives, forever?" His words are raw, filled with a desperation he is too afraid to express aloud. He hides them behind the formality of his letters, but the truth is that Makar is terrified. Terrified that his love for Varvara is unreciprocated, that his dreams will always remain out of reach, and that the weight of his poverty will eventually crush him completely. Each letter he sends is like a small prayer, a plea for something more. But the silence that follows is deafening. Varvara's letters become less frequent, and Makar's hope begins to wane. He still clings to the belief that something can change, that one day he will find a way out of this misery. But deep down, he knows that time is running out. The days pass, each one blending into the next, and Makar is no closer to his dream than he was when he first put pen to paper. As the months drag on, Makar's thoughts become darker, more consumed by the harshness of his life. He begins to question everything, the value of his work, the worth of his existence, and the very idea of hope. It seems as though, no matter how much he yearns for change, the world will never bend to his will. And yet, as he sits at his desk late one evening, his mind begins to wander once more to Varvara. One cold morning, when the air in the office seemed even more suffocating than usual, a new figure entered Makar's world. He arrived with an air of confidence, a stranger who seemed to possess everything that Makar lacked: youth, good looks, a sharp mind, and above all, the unmistakable sense of self-assuredness that comes with having something to offer the world. His name was Anton, and he had been hired as a fellow clerk in the same office, although his role seemed far more important than Makar's. Makar could not help but notice Anton the moment he walked into the office, his coat neatly tailored, his shoes polished to perfection. His presence was magnetic, drawing the attention of others like a moth to a flame. The other clerks greeted him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity, eager to learn more about the newcomer. It was as though Anton had stepped out of a different world, one that Makar could never hope to enter. The contrast between the two men was stark. While Makar sat hunched at his desk, his clothes faded and threadbare, Anton carried himself with an almost arrogant ease. He moved with purpose, his gaze sharp, as though he were already mapping out the future with every step he took. Makar watched him in silence, both fascinated and repelled by the stranger's assuredness. It was as if Anton had the world at his feet, while Makar had nothing but the endless, grinding monotony of his own existence. At first, Anton paid Makar no mind. He seemed to dismiss him as just another insignificant figure in the sea of bureaucracy. But over time, Makar began to notice that Anton's gaze would occasionally linger on him, as though the newcomer was studying him. Makar could feel the weight of that gaze, and it made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being noticed, especially by someone like Anton. He was just a clerk, a faceless part of the machinery of the office. One day Anton approached Makar's desk. His voice was smooth, carrying an air of casual familiarity. "You're Devushkin, aren't you?" he asked, his tone almost friendly. Makar looked up from his work, startled. The stranger was addressing him. "Yes?" "Yes, I am," Makar replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He fidgeted nervously with the papers on his desk, unsure of how to respond. Anton's presence was overwhelming, and Makar felt small in comparison. Anton smiled, a knowing smile, as if he were amused by the discomfort. He paused. "I hear you've been here for a while. How is it, working in such a place?" he asked, his words casual, but there was something probing in his eyes. Makar swallowed hard, his mind racing. He knew he was being evaluated, but by whom? Why? It's fine," he muttered, unable to meet Anton's gaze for long. "I do my work, like everyone else." Anton chuckled softly, leaning against Makar's desk. "I imagine you do. But tell me, Devushkin, do you ever think about the future? Or are you content to drift along like the rest of us?" Makar's heart raced at the question. He didn't know how to answer. I don't really think about it," he said, his voice faltering. I just do what I can." Anton raised an eyebrow. "Is that all? Just doing what you can? You must dream of more than this, don't you?" He leaned in closer, his eyes studying Makar's face with an intensity that made Makar uneasy. Makar shifted in his seat, suddenly, aware of the gulf between them. Anton's words, though seemingly innocent, felt like a sharp poke at his very soul. I suppose I dream of a better life," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "But dreams are just dreams, aren't they? Nothing ever changes." Anton laughed. the sound rich and full of mockery. "Is that so? You think dreams are nothing more than idle fantasies?" He looked at Makar as if he were an interesting specimen, something to be dissected and analyzed. "Perhaps you're right. But let me tell you something, Devushkin. There are people in this world who don't just dream. They make their dreams real. They don't wait for things to happen. They make things happen. And you—" He paused, his gaze piercing. "You seem to be waiting. Waiting for something, perhaps. But what are you waiting for?" Makar felt a pang of shame rise in his chest. Anton was right. He had been waiting, always waiting for some miracle, some change that would lift him out of his dreary existence. But he had never done anything to bring that change about. His life was a series of passive observations, a quiet acceptance of his fate. Anton, with his forceful presence, made Makar realize how small and insignificant he truly was. He had no ambition, no direction, just a lingering hope that somehow things would improve. I don't know," Makar said softly, his voice trembling. "I don't know what to do." Anton's smile faded, replaced by a look of something like pity. "Then maybe you'll never understand," he said, his tone hardening. "People like you are content to live in their misery. But I don't have time for that. I'm going places, Devushkin. I suggest you start thinking about where you're going to." With that, Anton turned and walked away, leaving Makar in stunned silence. The words echoed in his mind, reverberating through his thoughts. "Where are you going?" The question lingered, unanswered. Makar sat back in his chair, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anton's words had struck a nerve, awakening a sense of bitterness in him that he hadn't known existed. Who was Anton to come into his life and question everything? What right did he have to tell him that he was nothing but a passive observer? And yet, deep down, Makar knew that Anton was right in one regard. He had been waiting for something to change, but he had done nothing to make it happen. The office grew colder in the days that followed Anton's arrival. Makar spent more time than ever reflecting on the conversation they had, the words Anton had so carelessly thrown at him as if they were nothing more than passing remarks. Yet, for Makar, they had lodged themselves deep within him, festering and gnawing at the very core of his self-perception. Where am I going? The question repeated itself like a drumbeat in his mind. He knew the answer, but it was a bitter truth he couldn't face. He was going nowhere. As Makar sat at his desk, lost in his thoughts, the usual dull hum of the office around him faded away. The paper before him blurred, the ink on the page forming nothing but a smudge of words that made little sense. His mind was elsewhere. It was on the small scraps of paper that lay hidden in his drawer, his letters to Varvara. He had not written to her in days, the weight of his own shame and his growing sense of inadequacy making it difficult to form the words he so desperately needed to say. What could he tell her? How could he explain that he had lost his direction, that he no longer knew who he was or what he wanted? How could he, who had always been so sure in his affection for her, now confess that he had become a stranger, even to himself? But still, he could not silence the need to reach out to her. So, that evening, Makar took the pen in his trembling hand and began to write once more, his words spilling out in a desperate attempt to communicate his inner turmoil. "Dearest, Varvara," he began, the words coming slowly at first, as if they were dredging up memories he had long buried. "I hope this letter finds you in good health, though I fear that my own spirit is far from well. You see, I've come to a realization, and I don't know how to share it with you. The truth is, Varvara, I feel lost. Every day feels the same, like I am stuck in a cycle that never ends. I go to work, I come home, and nothing changes. Do you understand? The world around me moves forward, but I remain in place, standing still, unable to break free." He paused, his hand hovering over the paper, as he tried to find the right words to explain the depth of his despair. The silence of the room pressed against him, the faint ticking of the clock in the corner sounding louder than ever. He thought of Anton, of the stranger who had stepped into his life and shaken his world so profoundly. Anton, with his bold, unrelenting presence, had forced Makar to confront the very things he had been avoiding. And in that confrontation, Makar had realized that he had no answers, no path forward. His life was a series of stagnant moments, each, one blending into the next. He continued to write, the ink on the page forming shapes that seemed almost foreign to him. Sometimes I wonder if I am destined to remain as I am, to be nothing more than a humble clerk, buried beneath the weight of my own insignificance. I try to imagine a different life, a better life, but the dreams seem distant, like stars that are too far to reach. I dream of escape, Varvara, of freedom, but the walls around me are too high. Do you ever feel like this, like you are trapped, no matter how hard you try to break free? The letter was heavy with his longing, and yet Makar could not help but feel that it would not be enough. Would Varvara understand the depth of his pain, or would she read these words and see nothing more than the ramblings of a man who had no control over his own life? His fears grew with every word he wrote, but still he could not stop. Writing to her was the only thing that kept him tethered to some semblance of hope. I am sorry, Varvara, he wrote, his hand growing shakier as he neared the end of the letter. I wish I could be the man you deserve, the man you need, but I fear that I am not him. I fear that I am nothing more than a shadow in your life, a reminder of the very thing I have come to despise, my own weakness. As he finished the letter, Makar leaned back in his chair, exhausted. His chest felt heavy, as though the weight of his thoughts had settled inside him, pressing against his ribs. He had bared his soul to Varvara, yet he still felt as though he had said nothing at all. There was so much more he wanted to share, so much more he longed to express, but the words escaped him, leaving him stranded in the silence of his own mind. The letter, now folded carefully and sealed with a single drop of wax, sat on his desk. Makar stared at it for a long moment, his mind still consumed by the thoughts that had swirled around him for so many days. He wondered, as he had so many times before, if Varvara would even read the letter, or if it would be lost among the other letters she received. Would she even care to know the truth? Would she understand the depth of his loneliness, his isolation? As Makar sat there, lost in the uncertainty of his own emotions, he realized that he was not just writing to Varvara. He was writing to himself, trying to make sense of the confusion and despair that had overtaken him. He was searching for something, anything, that would give him the strength to keep going. The days after Makar sent his letter to Varvara were marked by a peculiar emptiness. He found himself drifting through the monotony of his work with even less purpose than before. He feared her response, yet he longed for it. Each evening, as he returned home to his small, damp apartment, he wondered if a letter from her might be waiting for him, a lifeline to anchor him in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent. It was during one such evening, as he walked the familiar streets, back from the office, that something unusual occurred. The city was bathed in the dim glow of gas lamps, their flickering light casting long shadows on the cobblestone streets. The air was damp, filled with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Makar, lost in thought, nearly collided with a young boy who had darted out from an alleyway. "Watch where you're going," the boy snapped, though his tone was more surprised than angry. Makar took a step back, startled. The boy couldn't have been older than 10, his face smudged with dirt and his clothes little more than rags. He clutched a bundle of papers under one arm and a satchel slung over the other. I'm sorry," Makar stammered, his gaze dropping to the ground. The boy, however, looked up at him with a sharp, almost defiant expression. "You've got eyes, don't you?" the boy said, though there was a flicker of curiosity in his tone. "What are you doing, wandering around like some ghost?" Makar hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The boy's bluntness caught him off guard. But there was something disarming about him, something that reminded Makar of the innocence he had long since lost. "I was just walking home," Makar finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy narrowed his eyes, studying Makar for a moment before shrugging. "You look like you've got troubles. Everyone does, I guess. I've got papers to deliver, so I'd better go." "Wait," Makar said, surprising even himself with the urgency in his tone. The boy paused, his small frame illuminated by the flickering lamplight. "What's your name?" "Vanya," the boy replied, shifting the weight of the papers in his arms. "Why?" Makar didn't have a good answer. He didn't know why he cared, why this chance encounter with a boy he had never met felt significant. He faltered, then shook his head. "Never mind, be careful out there." Vanya gave him a puzzled look, but nodded. "You too," he said, before disappearing down the street, his small figure swallowed by the shadows. Makar stood there for a long moment, staring after the boy. Something about the encounter had stirred a feeling within him, a faint echo of something he couldn't quite place. Vanya's sharp wit, his defiant spirit, reminded Makar of the resilience he had once possessed. It was a small thing, a fleeting moment, but it stayed with him as he continued his walk home. When Makar reached his apartment, his thoughts were still on the boy. He wondered what kind of life Vanya lived, what struggles he faced, and how he managed to carry himself with such determination despite his circumstances. Makar envied him, in a way. The boy had a spark, a fire that Makar had long since lost. That night, as he sat at his desk, the encounter with Vanya fueled his pen as he began another letter to Varvara. "Dearest Varvara," he wrote, the words flowing more freely this time, "I had a strange encounter today, one that has stayed with me in a way I did not expect. I met a young boy named Vanya, a street urchin who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his small shoulders. He reminded me of something I had forgotten, that even in the face of hardship, there is strength to be found in resilience. It was a fleeting moment, but it made me wonder if I, too, could find that strength within myself." He paused, the pen hovering over the paper as he considered his next words. "I have been lost, Varvara, as I told you in my last letter. But meeting this boy, seeing the fire in his eyes, has given me a small glimmer of hope. Perhaps it is not too late for me to find my way. Perhaps I have been searching in the wrong places, looking outward when I should have been looking within. I do not know what this realization means yet, but it feels significant, as though it is the first step toward something new." Makar set the pen down and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in weeks, he felt a small sense of peace, a quiet reassurance that perhaps his life was not as empty as it had seemed. The encounter with Vanya had reminded him that even in the darkest moments, there could be sparks of light, fleeting but meaningful. As the night deepened and the city outside grew quiet, Makar allowed himself to hope, just a little, that change was still possible. Days turned into weeks, and Makar found himself dwelling more and more on his encounter with Vanya. Something about the boy's resilience had awakened a sliver of curiosity within him, a desire to understand the lives of others who struggled in ways that mirrored his own. He began to take notice of the world around him during his daily walks, faces in the crowd, fleeting moments of joy or despair, the hidden lives of those he had once ignored in his own haze of self-pity. The responses from Varvara, though infrequent, provided him with some comfort. Her letters carried a warmth that softened his loneliness, though they often bore hints of concern. She encouraged him to keep writing, to continue sharing his thoughts and struggles with her. It became clear that his words had touched her, but they also left her worried about the depth of his despair. One evening, as Makar walked home through the narrow streets, the chill in the air hinting at the coming winter, he spotted a familiar figure. Vanya was sitting on the steps of a building, the bundle of papers that had once been under his arm, now scattered beside him. The boy's head was bowed, his small frame hunched, as though the weight of the world had finally become too much to bear. Makar hesitated. He had no reason to approach the boy, no obligation to involve himself in a life that was not his own. And yet something propelled him forward. Perhaps it was the memory of Anton's words, the lingering sense that he had been waiting for too long, letting life pass him by without action. "Vanya," Makar called out softly as he approached. The boy looked up, his face streaked with dirt and his eyes red-rimmed from crying. For a moment his expression was guarded, but when he recognized Makar, his features softened slightly. "You again," Vanya muttered, quickly wiping at his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "What do you want?" Makar crouched down, lowering himself to the boy's level. "I saw you sitting here and thought you might need some help," he said gently. "What's happened?" Vanya hesitated, his small hands clenching into fists. "It's nothing," he said stubbornly. But his voice cracked, betraying the pain he was trying so hard to hide. "It doesn't look like nothing," Makar said, his tone calm, but insistent. "Sometimes it helps to talk about things. I've been learning that myself." The boy glanced at him, suspicion flickering in his eyes. But then, perhaps sensing the sincerity in Makar's words, he relented. "My papers," he said quietly, gesturing to the crumpled sheets beside him. "Some older boys grabbed them and tore them up. They said I didn't belong here, that I should go back to the gutter where I came from." Makar's heart sank at the boy's words. He could see the shame and hurt etched on Vanya's face, the quiet fury of a child trying to stand tall despite the cruelty of the world. "I'm sorry that happened," he said softly. "People can be cruel, especially when they think they're better than others. But you don't have to let them decide who you are." Vanya looked at him, his eyes searching Makar's face for something, reassurance perhaps, or understanding. "What would you know about it?" the boy asked, though his tone lacked the sharpness it had carried before. Makar smiled faintly. "More than you might think. I've spent a lot of my life feeling small, like I didn't matter. It's not easy to keep going when the world seems to be against you, but you've already shown that. You're stronger than most. You stood up to those boys, didn't you?" Vanya shrugged, his expression uncertain. "I tried, but it didn't matter. They still won." "Maybe they did this time," Makar admitted. "But every time you stand back up, you're showing them and yourself that they can't break you. That's what matters in the end." For a long moment the boy said nothing. Then he nodded, a small, hesitant motion, as though he was testing the idea in his mind. "Maybe," he murmured, "but it's hard." "I know it is," Makar said. "But you're not alone, Vanya. There are people who care, even if it doesn't always feel that way." The boy's gaze softened, and for the first time Makar saw a flicker of hope in his expression. "Thanks," Vanya said quietly, his voice barely audible. "For saying that," Makar nodded, rising to his feet. "Come on," he said, offering his hand. "Let's gather these papers. They might not be perfect, but they're still yours." Vanya hesitated, for only a moment before taking Makar's hand. Together they collected the scattered papers, smoothing out the creases as best they could. It was a small act, but it felt significant, a gesture of solidarity in a world that often felt so isolating. As Makar walked Vanya back to his small dwelling, he felt something stir within him. For the first time in a long while, he felt connected to someone, as though his actions had meaning beyond his own small world. It was a quiet moment, but it filled a void he had long thought irreparable. When he returned home that night, he wrote another letter to Varvara, the words flowing with a newfound sense of purpose. "Dearest Varvara," he began, "tonight I helped someone, a boy named Vanya, who has seen more hardship in his few years than I have in my entire life. I cannot explain it, but in helping him, I felt something change within me. For the first time in what feels like forever, I felt useful, like I mattered. Perhaps this is what I've been searching for, a reason to reach beyond myself, to find meaning in the connections we make with others." In the days that followed, Makar found himself looking for Vanya during his walks home from the office. Their encounter had left a lasting impression, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for the boy. Vanya had reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. It wasn't grand or life-altering, but it was something, a thread of connection that kept him tethered to the world. One evening, as the sky turned a muted gray and the first flakes of snow began to fall, Makar spotted Vanya again. The boy was standing in the shadow of a lamppost, his thin frame wrapped in a coat that was several sizes too large. He was holding a small bundle of papers, his head bowed against the biting wind. "Vanya!" Makar called out as he approached. The boy looked up, his face lighting up with a mixture of surprise and cautious optimism. "You again," he said, though his tone lacked the sharpness of their first encounter. "What are you doing out?" "Here. I could ask you the same," Makar replied with a faint smile. "Isn't it a bit cold to be delivering papers?" Vanya shrugged. "It's always cold. Doesn't matter much." Makar frowned at the boy's nonchalant response. "Do you have somewhere warm to go after this?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Vanya hesitated, his gaze darting away. "I manage," he said quietly, but the evasiveness in his tone told Makar all he needed to know. Without thinking, Makar reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a few coins. "Here," he said, holding them out to Vanya. "Get yourself something warm to eat." The boy stared at the coins, his expression unreadable. For a moment Makar thought he might refuse, but then Vanya took them, his fingers brushing against Makar's hand. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "It's nothing," Makar said, though the small act of kindness felt monumental to him. "Where do you stay, Vanya? Do you have family?" The boy's face darkened at the question, and he looked down at the snow-covered ground. "I've got no one," he admitted after a long pause. "Not anymore." Makar's chest tightened at the boy's words. He knew what it was like to feel alone, to carry the weight of the world without anyone to share it with. But to face that burden as a child, it was almost unbearable to imagine. "You're not as alone as you think," Makar said gently. "I'm here. And if you ever need help, you can come to me." Vanya looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of skepticism and something that resembled hope. "Why do you care?" he asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and suspicion. Makar hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it most," he said finally, "and because I see a lot of myself in you." The boy didn't respond, but his expression softened, and for the first time, Makar thought he saw a flicker of trust in his eyes. It was a fragile bond, but it was there, a thread of connection that bound them together in their shared loneliness. That night, as Makar sat down to write to Varvara, he found himself reflecting on his growing relationship with Vanya. The boy had become a beacon in his life, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there were opportunities to find meaning and connection. "Dearest Varvara," he wrote, "I found a reason to keep going, a small one perhaps, but a reason nonetheless. His name is Vanya, a boy who has faced more hardship than I can imagine. He has no family, no one to look after him, and yet he carries himself with a strength that humbles me. I've begun to look after him in whatever small ways I can. It's not much, but it feels important. It feels right." Makar paused, his pen hovering over the page. He thought of the boy's guarded expression, the way he had hesitated before taking the coins. Vanya was a survivor, but he was also just a child, vulnerable and in need of care. "I don't know what will come of this," Makar continued, "but for the first time in a long while, I feel like I have a purpose. Perhaps it's selfish to say, but helping him helps me too. It reminds me that even in the smallest acts of kindness, there is a kind of salvation." As he finished the letter, Makar felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. His relationship with Vanya was still new, still fragile, but it had given him something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The next day, Makar made a decision. He would do more for Vanya, find a way to give the boy a chance at a better life. It wouldn't be easy. Makar's own resources were limited, but he couldn't stand by and watch the boy struggle alone. Vanya had become more than just a chance encounter. He was a part of Makar's life now, a thread woven into the fabric of his existence, and, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Makar felt that his life had meaning. As the weeks passed, Makar's bond with Vanya deepened. The boy, initially guarded and wary, began to trust Makar in small but meaningful ways. He would often wait for him in the evenings, perched on the steps of a building or leaning against a lamp-post, his small face lighting up whenever Makar appeared. Their conversations grew longer, and though Vanya rarely spoke of his past, his guarded demeanor slowly softened. Makar, too, found himself changing. The weight of his own troubles felt lighter now, his days imbued with a sense of purpose that had been absent for so long. He began to think about ways he could help Vanya more permanently. The boy deserved more than fleeting acts of kindness. He deserved stability, a chance to thrive. One chilly evening, as they walked together through the snow-dusted streets, Makar broached the subject. "Vanya," he began cautiously, his breath visible in the frosty air, "have you ever thought about going to school?" The boy glanced at him, his expression skeptical. "School?" he repeated, as though the word were foreign to him. "What for?" "To learn," Makar said gently, "to have a chance at something more. You're smart, Vanya. I can see it in the way you talk, the way you think. You could do so much if you had the opportunity." Vanya shrugged, kicking at a patch of ice on the ground. "Don't need school to survive," he muttered. "I've done fine so far." "Surviving isn't the same as living," Makar said quietly. "You deserve more than just getting by. You deserve a chance to dream, to build a life you're proud of." The boy didn't respond right away, his small face thoughtful, as he processed Makar's words. Finally, he glanced up at him. "And how would I do that?" he asked. "I've got no money, no one to help me. People like me don't get those chances." "You have me," Makar said firmly. "I may not have much, but I'll do everything I can to help you. We can find a way, together." Vanya's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked as though he didn't know what to say. "Why would you do that?" he asked, his voice tinged with both wonder and suspicion. "Why would you help me?" "Because I believe in you," Makar said simply, "and because no one should have to face the world alone." The boy looked down at his feet, his shoulders hunched against the cold. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "No one's ever said that to me before." Makar's heart ached at the boy's words, but he kept his tone steady. "Well, it's true, and it's about time someone told you." That night, Makar sat down at his desk with a renewed sense of determination. He began drafting a plan, his thoughts racing as he considered how best to help Vanya. He knew it wouldn't be easy. His own finances were meager, and his influence in the city was non-existent. But he also knew that he couldn't let the boy continue to fend for himself in a world that had shown him so little kindness. He wrote another letter to Varvara, pouring out his thoughts and hopes. "Dearest Varvara," he began, "I find myself at a crossroads, one that I never expected to encounter. There is a boy, Vanya, whom I have grown close to over these past weeks. He is bright and resilient, but life has been cruel to him. He has no family, no home, no one to guide him. And yet, despite it all, he carries a spark that I cannot ignore. I want to help him, Varvara. I want to give him a chance at something better. But I fear that my own limitations will make it impossible. My resources are few, and my influence even less. Still, I cannot let that stop me. I must try, for his sake and for mine. I have begun to wonder if this is my purpose, the thing I have been searching for all along, helping in the world of the drink that can be fine, even though I'm all It has given me hope, Varvara. A fragile hope, but hope nonetheless." As he finished the letter, Makar felt a sense of resolve settle over him. He didn't know how he would accomplish his goal, but he knew that he couldn't give up. Vanya had become more than just a chance encounter. He was a lifeline, a reason to believe in the possibility of change. The next day, Makar took the first step in his plan. He visited a small charity organization in the city, one that provided aid to orphans and street children. The office was modest, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, but its walls were lined with books and posters advocating for the welfare of children. Makar explained Vanya's situation to the woman who ran the organization, a kind but no-nonsense individual named Natalia. She listened intently, her sharp eyes studying him as he spoke. "It's not uncommon," she said when he finished. "There are so many children like Vanya, struggling to survive on the streets. We do what we can, but our resources are limited." "I understand," Makar said, "but I'll do whatever it takes to help him. I'm willing to contribute what I can, to volunteer if needed. I just want to give him a chance." Natalia nodded, her expression softening. "You're a good man," she said, "and it's clear that you care deeply about this boy. Let's see what we can do together." As Makar left the office that day, he felt a flicker of hope. It was a small step, but it was something, a beginning. For the first time in years, he felt as though he was moving toward something meaningful, something that could make a difference. And though the road ahead would be difficult, Makar knew that he couldn't turn back now. Vanya's future depended on it. In the following days, Makar's determination to help Vanya only grew stronger. He visited the charity office regularly, working with Natalia to find a way to get the boy enrolled in school and into a safer living situation. The process was slower than he had hoped, filled with bureaucratic hurdles and paperwork that seemed endless. But Makar didn't mind. The work gave him a sense of purpose, something to hold on to during the long, cold nights when the darkness of winter seemed to seep into his bones. One afternoon, as Makar was walking through the city's winding streets, he spotted Vanya sitting alone on the curb. The boy's eyes were fixed on the ground, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Makar's heart tightened at the sight, and he quickened his pace. "Vanya," Makar called gently, kneeling beside the boy. "What's wrong?" Vanya didn't look up at first, his eyes shadowed with the same weariness that had become a permanent fixture on his young face. Finally he spoke, his voice small and filled with frustration. "I don't think I can do it, Makar. I don't think I can go to school. I'm not like the other kids. They'll laugh at me." Makar sat down beside him, his voice calm but insistent. "Vanya, I understand that you're scared, but you're stronger than you think. You've already shown so much courage just by making it this far. School won't be easy, but you can do it. I know you can." The boy shook his head, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't belong there. They'll see who I really am." Makar placed a hand on Vanya's shoulder, offering him the only reassurance he could. "You belong there because you're human, Vanya, just like everyone else. Don't let your past decide your future. Your past doesn't define you." For a moment the boy didn't respond. He simply stared at the ground, his lips pressed into a thin line. But after a few moments he looked up at Makar, his eyes filled with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. "What if I fail?" Makar smiled faintly. "Failure is part of learning. The only real failure is not trying at all. You've already taken the hardest step by deciding to move forward. I'll be here every step of the way to help you." Vanya didn't answer immediately, but Makar could see the shift in him. The boy's shoulders had relaxed ever so slightly, and for the first time in a while, there was a faint spark of hope in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. In the days that followed, Makar continued to work with Natalia, pushing forward with the plans to get Vanya into a school and provide him with a safe place to stay. The charity had managed to find a spot for him in a small, modest orphanage on the outskirts of the city, a place that, while not perfect, offered a far better environment than the streets. The day Vanya moved into the orphanage was bittersweet for Makar. He had grown attached to the boy, and though he knew it was the best decision for Vanya, part of him felt the sting of loss. But he reminded himself that this was just the beginning, that he was helping the boy build a future that was worth fighting for. Vanya, too, seemed conflicted. The boy had always been wary of trusting others, and now, with his new surroundings, he was hesitant to let his guard down. Yet, there was something different in the way he spoke when Makar came to visit him a few days later. "It's not as bad as I thought," Vanya admitted, sitting on the edge of his bed, his legs dangling off the side. "The people here, they're not as bad as I thought. I think I could get used to this." Makar smiled softly, his heart swelling with pride. "I'm glad to hear that, Vanya. You deserve a chance at something better." Vanya looked up at him, his expression uncertain but open. "You really think so?" "I know so," Makar said firmly, "and I'll be here for you every step of the way. You're not alone anymore." For a long moment the boy simply stared at him, as though weighing his words. Then, finally, he nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks, Makar," Vanya said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Makar's heart swelled with emotion, but he held his composure. "You would have found your way, Vanya. You're strong, but I'm glad I could help." Later that evening, as Makar sat at his desk, writing yet another letter to Varvara, he reflected on the journey that had led him to this point. His life had changed in ways he hadn't expected. Helping Vanya had become more than just a charitable act. It had become a mission, a way to rediscover his own purpose. "Dearest Varvara," he wrote, "I don't know how to explain it, but I feel that something has shifted in me. In helping Vanya, I have found something I was missing for so long, a sense of belonging, a sense of duty. I can't say that I'm perfect, that I've done everything right, but I know that I've given this boy a chance at a better life. And in doing so, I've found my own redemption. He's not out of the woods yet. There will be struggles, hardships, moments when he feels like giving up, but I will be there for him, just as you have always been there for me. I will help him find his way, as you helped me find mine." Makar paused, his pen hovering over the page. A smile spread across his face, a rare, unguarded expression that had not appeared in years. "Perhaps," he continued, "this is what I was meant to do after all." Time passed, and with each day, Makar's connection to Vanya grew stronger. The boy, once so uncertain and defensive, began to find his place in the orphanage. He attended school, though he struggled with the lessons at first, his mind burdened with the weight of his past. But Makar was there, offering encouragement and guidance whenever Vanya faltered, reminding him that he didn't have to carry the weight alone. Vanya's progress was slow but steady. He became more confident in his studies, showing a natural aptitude for math and a curiosity for literature that surprised Makar. It was as if the boy had been waiting for someone to believe in him, to give him the space to grow. And now, with Makar's help, Vanya was starting to believe in himself. One afternoon, several months after Vanya's move to the orphanage, Makar visited him for the first time in weeks. The boy was sitting in the common room, engrossed in a book. When Makar entered, Vanya looked up, his face lighting up with the kind of warmth that had once been so foreign to him. "Hey," Vanya said, setting the book down beside him. "It's been a while," Makar smiled. "It has. How's everything going?" Vanya hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Good. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's better. I'm starting to get the hang of things. I like school. I like learning." Makar's heart swelled with pride. "I knew you had it in you." The boy looked up at him, a thoughtful expression on his face. I've been thinking about what you said, about my future, and, well, I think I want to do something with my life. I don't know what yet, but I want to make something of myself." Makar felt a lump form in his throat. "You will, Vanya. You've already taken the hardest step, and I'll be here to help you along the way." Vanya smiled, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Thanks, Makar. I wouldn't have gotten this far without you." Makar's voice grew soft, filled with a deep emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "You would have, Vanya. You're strong. But I'm glad I could be part of your journey." The boy nodded, his eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and resolve. I won't forget what you've done for me. You gave me a chance when no one else would." Makar felt a lump rise in his throat as he met Vanya's gaze. "And you've given me something too, a reason to believe that change is possible, that even the smallest acts of kindness can have a lasting impact." As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Makar continued to visit Vanya, watching him grow into the young man he was meant to be. The road ahead was still long, filled with challenges and obstacles, but Makar knew that Vanya was no longer alone in facing them. One cold winter's evening, as Makar sat by his fireplace, writing yet another letter to Varvara, he reflected on the journey he had been on. He thought of Vanya, of the boy who had come from nothing, who had struggled and fought for every step forward, and he thought of himself, the man who had once believed that kindness had no place in a world so cold and indifferent, but who had found through his relationship with Vanya that even the smallest light could pierce the darkness. "Dearest Varvara," Makar wrote, "I don't know where this journey will lead, but I know it has already changed me in ways I never expected. Helping Vanya has given me more than I could ever have imagined. It has given me purpose, a reason to hope, and a reminder that even in the harshest of times, we have the power to make a difference. Vanya is still young, and there will be times when he stumbles, when he doubts himself. But I know he will rise. He is learning, growing, and becoming the person he was always meant to be. And though I may not be there to see every step of his journey, I know that I have done what I could to set him on the right path. I can't help but feel that in helping him, I have found my own redemption. Perhaps this is what I was meant to do all along, to give someone else the chance to believe in themselves, as you once gave me the chance to believe in myself. The road ahead may be uncertain, but I know this: it is a road worth walking." Makar set the pen down and leaned back in his chair, gazing out the window at the snow falling gently outside. The world felt quieter now, softer, as if the weight of his own burdens had lifted, even if only for a moment. And in that quiet, he realized that he was no longer searching for meaning. He had found it, in the small acts of kindness, in the belief that change was possible, and in the bond he had forged with a boy who had once been invisible to the world. And perhaps in helping Vanya find his way, Makar had found his own. With that final thought, Makar knew the road ahead would be long and filled with uncertainty. But it was no longer a road he would walk alone. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace.